This week on To the Contrary.
First, the third Women's March goes on amidst controversy and infighting. Will this year's march have as much impact? Behind the headlines, millions of Americans are forced out of work and into early retirement by an insidious bias, ageism.
Hello, I'm Bonnie Beyer. Welcome to the Contrary, a discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. Up first, the Women's March.
Despite controversy and negative media coverage, the march will go on. It's been nearly 2 years since more than 4 million women and men descended on Washington for the historic Women's March the day after President Trump's inauguration. There were also large marches in cities across the country. This year, some hundreds of organizations representing women of all religions, ethnicities, and backgrounds are joining together to fight for equality.
Thousands of women ran, and then, a historic number of women were elected. And there were many women who said that the reason that they were voting, the reason that they were running, the reason that they were getting involved was because of Women's March. And I think that, and we are just one of, a ecosystem of movements who are working on, women's rights. But I do think that Women's March has shaped and expanded the political imagination of women.
The Washington, D.C. march is expected to draw large crowds, but not as big as 2017. Hundreds of sister marches will take place, but many of the smaller marches have been canceled, including ones in Chicago, New Orleans, and in Northern California. At issue, first, 3 of the national group's board members are accused of anti-Semitism. Second, women of color question why the march is overwhelmingly white. Third, a tweet criticizing white women for not voting the way the group wanted them to. But local and national organizers are urging women and men to come out.
In the course of conversation at Women's March, extraordinarily painful and problematic things said to me. And to my mind, the choice is to remain at the table anyway.
The Cleveland March has invited members of the National Council on Jewish Women to speak, and the New York City March plans to highlight the leadership of women of color, immigrant women, and gender non-conforming people.
So, Donna Edwards, is the coalition, the Women's Coalition, falling apart?
No, it's not falling apart, but I think inevitably when you have these really organic movements that have developed, that they have a kind of flat leadership structure, and that is both good and it's bad. And I think what you're seeing here is really what's at stake, which is women have different opinions about a whole bunch of things, including the Women's March.
Yeah, I mean, historically, marches can be a very effective public opinion tool, but I think that the Women's March and the unity principles, they need to recognize that there are lots of different viewpoints out there, and hopefully they'll be more inclusive.
And, the march that mattered was the one we saw of women marching to vote in November, rendering the most gender-equal Congress we've ever seen.
I think the 2017 march was the start of something, and I suspect that it will continue going forward, regardless of whether the march happens at the beginning of every year.
Now, what about, for example, this week, part of Ashley Judd's lawsuit against Harvey Weinstein was thrown out. Is this a signal that the Me Too movement, so closely tied to the march, is losing steam?
I don't know enough about that particular case. I don't think all of this is losing steam. I think there was a tremendous amount of attention given to it over the last 2 years. So we may just need to, there may be a pause, and then we'll see more happen. I think when it comes to the march, though, and what it represents, what's interesting to me is there are a lot of principles on their website, if you really take a close look, that a lot of women would agree with. I think it's interesting, for instance, that they put criminal justice reform at the very top. And that's certainly something that I'm very interested in. I think that lots of people should be sort of learning about and reading more about. I think the challenges come when they sort of assume that everyone agrees on the solutions to some of these issues. So they talk about the problem of paid leave, or they talk about the problem of sexual violence. I agree with those problems. I think that I don't feel necessarily welcome at the table to have a conversation, and I think that's where there could be huge improvements made.
Well, I did. I asked her. I asked Rachel Carmona when we did that interview that women who are so-called pro-life, anti-abortion, whatever term you use, are some of them have complained saying they feel left out. She said, well, we are a pro-choice movement. Right. So, she said, we welcome if they want to show up and march, we welcome them. But do you think your side has been a little, it seems like complaining to me rather than for the point of complaining, as opposed to, would somebody go to the NRA and say, I'm anti-gun, so why won't you let me become a member?
I mean, Jen might feel differently. I think the challenge and what I hear from colleagues is that if you suggest that you represent all women, and then you do need to include all women.
Says all women?
Well, I think that's their
all women.
The idea, though, however, I think is that they represent all women's ideas, right?
Progressive women.
Yeah, but I don't think that's always.
I guess the thing is, it's not called the Progressive Women's March.
Yeah.
I guess that's the way I viewed it. Is when I heard woman, I thought woman meant me too, right? Maybe we're not hashtag me tooing right now, but I think the thing that I think about is maybe somewhat sort of contrarian in the sense that you're seeing all these sort of splinter movements, whether you're seeing a splinter march in New York or California or Atlanta, you're seeing African American women have their own sort of movement. You're seeing Republican women acknowledge that, again, there's the March for Life, there's a pro-life movement that continues on, and I think that's all positive. So I think the Women's March starts something, and I think we saw some of that with the midterm election in November. I think I would have loved to have that movement be more aggressive on the Republican side. Unfortunately, it was not. But in the absence of that, you're seeing, I think it's okay for us to have a lot of different types of women's groups gathering together to fight for the same sort of common goal.
And I think there's a Venn diagram where some of the groups that you described will have great common ground, and that common ground will move forward. And we're looking at Virginia right now could become the 38th state to ratify an equal rights amendment. And I think there's unanimity among all of those groups around, yes, we should have equal rights in a democracy.
But is the Women's March falling prey in some way, shape, or form? Obviously, it's still a force to be reckoned with. There's still 200-plus sister marches around the country, and a lot of what Rachel Carmona said would happen is that maybe not everybody's going to come from Ohio or California all the way to Washington, but they will participate in more local marches. But by the same token, with all this, with not really doing anything in response to complaints of anti-Semitism, the 3 women who were accused are still on the national board. Should they have been thrown off? This talk about, it's entirely white women. Nobody's stopping women of color from showing up. I mean, if white women show up, should they be criticized for? Are we getting too much into
internecine?
Right.
No, but I do think that one of the challenges has always been a challenge, frankly, of the broader women's movement is to make it a more inclusive movement so that women of color feel like they have a voice at the table, at the leadership table, at the decision-making table, not just like showing up to a march. But with marches, I think it's always tough to have a do-over of something that was so wildly successful. And so maybe that should not be the expectation, but that you carry on the work, whether you're carrying it on at the federal level or in your state and local communities.
And, I was at the demonstration at the Supreme Court, and it was very, very diverse. And so, to make a generalization about 1 or 2 large protests, probably doesn't take the big picture in. I also think in 2016, there was an imperative to show up in Washington. And now that it is...
What do you mean an imperative?
Well, we just had the inauguration of a president that was perceived by a lot of women to be very anti-women.
Right.
And so I think they wanted to come to Washington and show their feelings about that and the fact that they'd missed the opportunity of having a woman president. And so there was that imperative to come to Washington. And I think that the organizers are correct, that we'll see the same perhaps numbers, but diffuse across the country.
But let's, because obviously the women who turned out, there was a lot of rage against President Trump, his treatment of women, his appointees, his reversing, Roe v. Wade, his attempts to anyway, all of his policies, the gag rule, you name it. That's still there. Yeah. So shouldn't that be energizing women? Wouldn't that still be energizing them to go to something like this?
Well, I remember looking at all the signage when I was at the march, and it was like all over the map. Yeah. I mean, people there for a whole bunch of different kinds of reasons. That's right. And so I think it's inevitable that, you're going to find groups of women who identify on a particular issue, and they're going to go forward on their issues. And but I don't think it's dead. And I think it's like a lot of movements, always struggling to figure out what the best leadership structure is. Who are the best leaders? Who are our best spokesperson? What's our message? That's not unlike any other movement.
Wasn't part of the march too, in terms of, you said, the mobilization against the president and the concern that a lot of women had across the country on the progressive side of the ledger, was to react to that by saying, well, come to Washington and do something about it. So they all ran for Congress, or many of them ran for Congress, many of them won. Many of them got motivated in that way. So to your point about, like, what does that mean for the march, my assumption would be that those women now have to put their money where their mouth is. They're here, and so now it's time to actually govern and get down to the brass tacks of oversight on the administration and pushing back, if that was the goal, to beat back some of these policies that women are concerned about.
And now is, I was just saying, now is also the time that it's time to sort of put down the signs and the rhetoric and things and come to the table and say, okay, if we all agree at this table that we need to have some form of paid leave support, what are the different policies we're looking at, and can we have a compromise that will satisfy everybody? And that doesn't grab the headlines in the same way, and it doesn't grab the cameras, but it's going to have a lasting impact for a lot of people.
And that's what we think women are good at.
But Donna, and you mentioned before the show about Congress passing something that if a member is accused successfully of and has to go to court of sexual harassment or assault, that he pays out of his own pocket as opposed to taxpayers' funds. That's the beginning of the policy changes that are going to take place, correct?
It is, and I think so. Congress is leading in that respect, saying we're going to act on what we promised, and that was kind of a first measure. I think what comes next is you don't put down the signs. You don't put down the signs because you still need the public pressure, even on these newly elected members, to make sure that what you wanted to happen does happen. And that, I think, is where the real change will come.
And what other changes in policy are we going to see? And by the way, you said the House passed that. Did the Senate approve it as well?
Well, they only have to do it that way because each chamber has to pass their own rules package. And so the House passed its rules package and the Senate passed its. But the point is...
Were the changes in the same changes in the Senate's package?
Yes, and the point is now taxpayers are not footing the bill from the bad behavior of members of Congress. And that becomes then a bellwether for what happens in private industry, for what happens throughout the country. And I think that this is just the beginning.
All right. We'll keep tabs on it. Let us know what you think. Please follow me on Twitter at Bonnie Urbay. Behind the headlines, discrimination takes on many forms, but one that isn't talked about much yet permeates our culture. That is ageism. New data support what many people have experienced firsthand, how age bias hurts Americans of every background.
Ageism is unfortunately alive and well in the U.S. among workers over 50, according to a new study. ProPublica and the Urban Institute analyzed data covering some 20,000 people from the time they turned 50 through the rest of their lives. They found 56% of those workers are laid off at least once or leave jobs under such financially damaging circumstances that it's likely they were pushed out. What's worse, the study found only 1 in 10 of those workers ever earned as much as they did before their employment setbacks. Bottom line was 28% of stable, long-time employees sustain at least one damaging layoff by their employers between turning 50 and leaving work for retirement. Another 13% of 50-plus workers in long-held positions unexpectedly retire under conditions suggesting they were forced out.
What this research report really pulls out is data around women, in particular, people of color, and the fact that this is a major public policy issue that we need to address as a country. How do we ensure that older adults are able to remain in the workplace as long as they need to, and that it's a benefit for employers, and they should be seen as a potential positive contribution to society.
Other research has shown older women are more frequently targets of work-related age discrimination than men. A 2015 study showed that older women's resumes were much less likely to receive callbacks than those of older men or young people of either gender.
When it comes to women and people of color, I think they're disproportionately impacted by aging. And in particular, if a man and woman are both laid off, women are disproportionately impacted negatively by that layoff because they probably have less resources saved, whether in retirement plan, whether in savings, whether in equity in a home, because they've probably developed wealth at a slower pace than a man.
The number of Americans aged 65 and older is expected to more than double from 46 million today to more than 98 million by the year 2060.
What are we doing to think about the infrastructure costs and needs, right? Is our healthcare system going to be able to sustain that type of growth? How about transportation? Are we making the signs big enough to be able to be read by this jump in an older population on highways? Metro, all of these things. So I think this is a great issue. We need to see more women focused on these issues from a leadership perspective, because it's not just important for women, it's important for families.
The National Council on Aging is fighting ageism this way.
First, it's about education. It's about talking to individuals in their 30s, their 40s, their 50s that, you know, the retirement of my grandfather or my grandmother is not the retirement for us today. Fact of the matter is we're living longer. Our healthcare costs will continue to increase. The number one asset that most seniors have today is their home, right? And so do they have a reverse mortgage? Do they have a second mortgage? So it's thinking now how you're investing in your future. And for women, more so. And then it's having that really high-level public policy discussion here in Washington, D.C. with our congressional representatives. It's talking to Fortune 500 companies about really what are their practices. And what we're advocating for at the National Council on Aging is to actually rethink how we think about diversity and inclusion in employment practices. It's adding this issue to the HR employee handbook about when you think about diversity, you think about the workplace, are you thinking about age diversity, gender diversity, race, all of the diversities that make a winning team?
So, Sabrina, what this boils down to is about 40% of workers over the age of 50 lose their jobs due to ageism. Wow. What needs to be done about this? And does it mean ageism is alive and well?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I hadn't read that much about this before the show, and I was, in preparation. And I think, obviously, we see this in every generation, sort of these technological shifts and cultural shifts and economic shifts that happen between the generations. I think what's interesting now is that, the kind of work people are doing doesn't force them out of the workforce naturally, right? If you are working on a farm, you get to a point where you maybe can't do that physical labor. Well, now we think about people getting older and having more experience and more contact and more value really for a business. And so it's interesting if we don't think about people as adding value as they age. I think that this is in large part sort of a cultural reframing that we need to have in conversation.
You know what's so funny is that this is a generation that's turning 50 that grew up saying, don't trust anyone over 30.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
I think,
as a boomer,
we're kind of getting it back now.
As a boomer, right. I wasn't supposed to ever get this old. How did it happen, right?
Exactly. When I turned 50, I started to say to people, they'd say, how old are you? I'd say, can you believe I'm 50? And they really believed it, so I went on saying that for about 10 more years. I think I have to hang that one up, though.
Right. No, but you're very cute. You're very funny, but it's not actually funny if you're on the opposite end of being turned out of your job because of age. And by the way, you talked about generational change. Okay, for the boomers, I guess old people started at 50. Right. Now you're considered old and
35
at 40. So it's getting younger and younger, especially with techies, or all these 25-year-old billionaires.
Look at the fight we just had in Congress. And who came out on top? Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi did not start her career until she was about 50.
I think
she has 5 children, maybe 48.
9 grandchildren.
She had 5 children, and she wanted to get them launched. And then she started her career. Well, can you imagine if they'd put her out to farm or to pasture at the beginning? What would have been the beginning? And, look at all the leadership she's given this country. Ben Franklin.
She's a wonderful example, and I hope all of corporate America and all other employers look at that and think twice about it. And that's the other thing. As men age, are they going to get it as they face ageism? Are they going to get it better about sexism?
I want to believe that.
I want them to get it better about ageism, right?
Right. And I think that's what we're talking about. It's not just that. But the thing that scares me is to think that women, aren't particularly women, aren't in a position to choose their retirement anymore. It's like being chosen for them. And so the idea that you can have a job and look over your shoulder between 50 and 70 and wonder at any moment if you're going to get taken out to pasture, if you will, is very disconcerting. And I think the point was made by the aging organizations that, many of these women aren't in a position to be able to be prepared for that financially or personally because they did start later. And so you started investing in your 401k later in life, and you're thinking, I may have to work to 75 to get to that place, and I got taken out at like 55. That's no good, right? And I think the other thing that was pointed out, too, is the fact that many of these women, when they are out of the workforce and they are displaced involuntarily, are in a situation where they're going to end up maybe getting a job if they're lucky, and if they do get a job, it's going to be at pay that's much dramatically less than what they were getting before.
They, women and men, always make less. Now, there's one upside to this, which is the development of what I call the freelance economy. Everybody's contracting, and so maybe with a number of different things that a person can do on a contractual basis, they can try to make as much money, close to as much money as they were before. Very few will be able to make more than they were making before, but that's the exception. Yeah. That's the Nancy Pelosi of the world.
Right. Yeah, I don't think that's a solution for an awful lot of women and men.
So what's the policy that needs to change?
That's where I'm going to go. So I think we really need to think about what the retirement age is. There's been this discussion for the longest time about raising the Social Security retirement age. I'd like to have more of a conversation about it, which happens in some countries, about lowering the retirement age, about allowing people in that in-between from 50 to 70 to buy into Medicare, which then brings their health care costs, all of our health care costs over. So I do think that there are real conversations on the policy end to get to this question about what's happening in the economy, because it isn't just about discrimination based on age. Wow. It's what's happening in the economy, what kind of economy we're creating, and whether it's one that allows us to work until we're 75 years old.
Can I respond to that real quickly? I think it's important that we do think about these policy changes, and two things come to mind as you're saying this. I think we have to be very careful that we don't encourage people to leave the workforce prematurely, because I think we know that working is very important to people's sort of whole life meaning. But the other thing is I think it reminds us why we need flexibility in some of our policies, especially when it comes to the workforce, because the fact is, a 22-year-old is cheaper than myself, right, at this point in my career. But she may or he may need things, health care and other benefits that I might not need, and I may need different things. And so we want people to be able to carve out the kind of work environment that suits them at different points, and we want to make sure our policies don't become so rigid that the 22-year-old and the 53-year-old have to have the same thing.
What do you see rigid?
Well, I think that when we think about things like pay structure, and we think about things like paid leave and health care, these are things that we want to make sure that everybody doesn't have to have the exact same packages, right? Because I can be on my husband's health care, for instance, the way I wouldn't have been able to when I was 22. So these are things that we want to make sure
what about, for example, making it easier to sue for ageism? I mean, that look at what's got the Me Too movement going. It's lawsuits against perpetrators, and that's where they get stung financially. That's how you get people to stop the threat of a lawsuit. So, do you think making lawsuits easier by people forced into retirement is a good policy?
I don't think it's a policy, right? I think it's something that should happen if it's a real thing, right? But
you change court-made law. Judges rule that to make it easier for these suits are very expensive.
Better, right, in the long.
But in the absence of that, going down the litigation route, I do think that there are things that companies can do to take a better and closer look. And we talk about diversity, and that many companies have diversity officers now, and diversity is always sort of viewed through gender and other facets of diversity. But we don't spend a lot of time talking about age and looking at employees and how we're making sure that benefits are adapted to reflect that, as well as the policies internally to a company. And yes, maybe if you get down a road, that needs to be the stick. But for now, I think we can hopefully have some of these companies do a better job of recognizing the complicated nature of aging. And
we are out of time. Sorry. That's it for this edition. Please follow me on Twitter. Visit our website, pbs.org/to the contrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next week. Go ahead and say what you're going to say. The audience
Whatever it is.